At 79, Vince McMahon finally speaks out about the wrestlers he couldn't stand, and the names he's been keeping quiet for decades are about to shock you. Behind the glitz and the grand spectacle of WWE lies a story of clashes, betrayals, and grudges that shaped the careers of some of wrestling's biggest stars. Today, we're diving deep into the wrestlers Vince openly admits he never trusted, never liked, and in some cases, actively worked against. This isn't your typical behind-the-scenes tale. It's raw, real, and full of surprises. Let's get into it. At the height of the Attitude Era, when blood, chairs, and chaos ruled WWE, there was one thing Vince McMahon couldn't stomach: the name Al Snow. While fans were busy chanting and waving styrofoam mannequin heads, behind the scenes, Vince was fuming. In his mind, the name Al Snow wasn't just bad, it was the worst name in wrestling history. And that wasn't an exaggeration. He actually said it. So, why did Vince hate it so much? According to insiders, Vince saw the name as a branding disaster. He thought it sounded more like a local plumber than a professional wrestler. No mystique, no edge, just Al Snow. In Vince's eyes, that name didn't sell tickets. It didn't move merch. It didn't scream superstar. And in WWE, that's all that matters. But here's the irony. Al Snow was over. Fans loved him. He had one of the weirdest, most memorable gimmicks of the late 90s. Carrying around a severed mannequin head with "Help Me" scrawled across his forehead. He blurred the line between comedy and chaos. He was weird, but it worked. Crowds popped. Kids bought the foam heads. "What does everybody want?" became a cult catchphrase. Still, that wasn't enough for Vince. Behind the scenes, Vince reportedly pushed for a name change. Multiple sources from that era claim that Vince wanted to rebrand Al with something more serious, something he'd put on posters and sell as a legitimate draw. But Al Snow wasn't just a name, it was a character, a package. Change one thing, and the whole thing unravels. That creative tension followed Al throughout his time in WWE. While other mid-carders were getting pushes, he often found himself in comedy segments or being fed to rising stars. Some believe Vince's disdain for the name, and perhaps the character, played a big part in that. It's no coincidence that despite his popularity with fans, Al Snow never quite broke through to the top tier. He was a guy the crowd loved, but management just didn't believe in. And here's where it gets really telling. Years later, when asked about the worst ring names in WWE history, Vince didn't mention some obscure 1980s jobber or forgettable developmental talent. He went straight to Al Snow. No hesitation. No explanation needed. Just, that name sucks. But this wasn't just about branding. It revealed something deeper about how Vince sees the wrestling business. To him, names are power. A great name can become a legend. Think The Rock, The Undertaker, Stone Cold. A weak name? It's a death sentence, no matter how talented the person behind it is. And for Al Snow, that name became a silent curse, one that followed him even after he left WWE. But Vince's list of disliked stars didn't end there. When Sabu signed with WWE, fans of extreme wrestling were hyped. Here was a guy who had made his name breaking tables, flying off chairs, and bleeding buckets in ECW. But while the fans may have been ready, Vince McMahon wasn't. From the moment Sabu entered WWE, he was under a microscope, and not in a good way. To Vince, Sabu represented chaos. Not the kind you script, but the kind you can't control. The kind that makes sponsors nervous and sends agents scrambling. He wasn't polished, he wasn't predictable, and worst of all, he was dangerous. The breaking point came during a match involving John Cena. Sabu reportedly missed a spot and came down hard, too hard, on WWE's Golden Boy. Vince was livid. For someone like McMahon, whose top stars are multi-million-dollar investments, any hint of recklessness is a red flag. And Sabu wasn't just reckless. He lived on the edge by default. That was the whole gimmick. But Vince didn't see a hardcore icon. He saw liability. From that point forward, Sabu was marked. No matter how well he performed, how intense the crowd reactions were, or how much of a cult following he had, McMahon didn't trust him. And in WWE, once Vince loses faith, there's no coming back. What makes this even more ironic is that Sabu had been a legend elsewhere. In ECW, he was a god. He tore down the house nightly with the likes of Rob Van Dam, Taz, and Terry Funk. But WWE isn't ECW, and Vince made that painfully clear. Backstage, the word was that McMahon thought Sabu was uncoachable. He didn't fit the mold. He didn't do promos the WWE way. He didn't care about corporate polish. He was old school, unpredictable, and flat-out wild. That might work in a bingo hall. But on live TV, with advertisers watching, not a chance. Sabu's WWE run ended quietly. No fanfare. No thank you moment. Just a silent exit and a sealed fate. Vince had labeled him too dangerous. And once that label stuck, it was game over. What's wild is that fans still talk about what could have been. Sabu versus Jeff Hardy? Sabu versus Rey Mysterio on a grand stage? Those dream matches never got the spotlight they deserved, all because Vince saw a risk where others saw art. But Sabu wasn't the only one Vince dismissed for going against the grain. If there's one thing Vince McMahon hates more than failure, it's being held hostage. And in October 1999, Jeff Jarrett did exactly that. Jarrett was set to defend the Intercontinental Championship against Chyna at WWE's No Mercy pay-per-view. There was just one problem. His contract had expired the night before. Technically, he wasn't under contract anymore, and he knew it. So, when WWE needed him to show up and lose the title to Chyna, making her the first woman to ever win the belt, Jarrett gave them a price, reportedly somewhere north of $300,000. Some say it was just back pay and bonuses he was owed. Others believe he saw a golden opportunity to squeeze WWE when they had no other choice. Either way, Vince saw it as blackmail. Jarrett showed up, did the job, and left the company the same night. The moment the 3 count hit, his WWE career was over. Not because of talent, not because of storylines, but because Vince McMahon doesn't forget. After that incident, Jarrett might as well have been blacklisted. When WCW eventually collapsed and WWE bought out its assets in 2001, Vince famously said on air that Jeff Jarrett is G-O-N-E gone. That wasn't just a character moment. It was personal. Vince didn't want him on the roster, in the building, or even in the same industry. And here's where it gets brutal. Jeff Jarrett went on to co-found TNA Wrestling, WWE's biggest U.S. competitor, during the early 2000s. While it never reached WWE's level, it drew solid TV ratings and featured future legends like AJ Styles, Samoa Joe, and Kurt Angle. In some ways, Jarrett became the thorn in Vince's side for years. Not because he beat WWE, but because he survived without it. Still, Vince never reached out. Not when TNA was hot, not when they cooled off, not when Jarrett entered the Hall of Fame discussions. Decades passed, but the grudge stayed alive. It wasn't until 2018, nearly 20 years later, that Jarrett was finally inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. Fans were stunned. Had Vince finally forgiven him? Sort of. Word backstage was that Triple H and other executives pushed hard for the reconciliation. Vince signed off, but sources say it wasn't warm. It was business. Jarrett had become a respected figure in wrestling, and WWE was opening its doors to more legacy names. The move made sense, but the tension never fully disappeared. To this day, that moment in 1999 remains one of the coldest examples of real-life heat turning into long-term exile. One match, one demand, one payday. And just like that, Vince McMahon made sure Jeff Jarrett would never forget the price of crossing him. And believe it or not, this wasn't even the most personal fallout Vince ever had. At a time when women in WWE were often treated as eye candy, one superstar pushed back and paid the price. Her name? Chyna. And her fall from grace wasn't just a storyline, it was personal. Chyna broke every mold. She wasn't just a women's wrestler. She was a woman who wrestled men, won the Intercontinental Championship, and became a cultural icon. In the late 90s, she was a phenomenon. Stronger than half the male roster, with a look and attitude that screamed power. Fans adored her. But behind the curtain, things were unraveling fast. Her relationship with Triple H was no secret backstage. They were a power couple, both rising through the ranks. But everything shifted when Triple H began seeing Stephanie McMahon. That wasn't just a love triangle, it was a time bomb. Because in WWE, crossing the boss's daughter, intentionally or not, can end your career in an instant. Chyna reportedly confronted Vince about the situation, demanding clarity about her role, her value, and her future in the company. According to multiple former WWE staff, the meeting didn't go well. Vince didn't appreciate ultimatums. And just like that, Chyna was gone. No farewell match, no send-off, no Hall of Fame induction. She vanished from WWE programming, as if she had never existed. Fans were confused, and rumors spread like wildfire. But inside WWE, it was clear. Chyna had pushed too hard, and Vince wasn't interested in dealing with the fallout. Over the next decade, Chyna's life spiraled. She struggled with public scandals, personal battles, and constant questions about why WWE had turned its back on her. While men with far worse records were welcomed back into the fold, Chyna remained persona non grata. And here's the painful truth. She helped build the very foundation WWE was standing on, yet her name was blacklisted. Vince reportedly believed her later choices in life had damaged the brand, especially when she entered the adult industry. It gave him all the justification he needed to keep her out of WWE's spotlight, no matter how loud the fan demand became. It wasn't until 2019, 3 years after her death, that Chyna was inducted into the Hall of Fame posthumously as part of D-Generation X. Even then, it was a group award, not a solo recognition, a move that felt more like damage control than a true tribute. To this day, fans argue she should have been honored years earlier. But in Vince's world, it's not just about what you do in the ring. It's about loyalty, optics, and control. And when Chyna broke ranks, she lost all three. But Vince didn't just have issues with stars who challenged him personally. Sometimes it was just about style, and that brings us to a certain loudmouth who talked his way onto Vince's bad side. Ken Anderson, better known to WWE fans as Mr. Kennedy, was on the fast track to the top. He had the look, the mic skills, and the attitude Vince usually loved. His entrance, screaming his own name into a descending microphone, was unforgettable. And when he won the Money in the Bank briefcase in 2007, it looked like a world title run was inevitable. But that's not what happened. Instead, Kennedy became one of the most high-profile examples of a push that disappeared overnight. And backstage whispers say Vince McMahon was the one who shut it all down. Why? Because Kennedy talked too much. Not just on TV, but backstage, in interviews, in locker rooms. He reportedly rubbed veterans the wrong way, including big names like Randy Orton and John Cena. And when you start making enemies at the top of the food chain, Vince starts listening very closely. The turning point came when Kennedy suffered what was initially thought to be a torn tricep. WWE had him drop the Money in the Bank briefcase, fearing he'd be out for months. But days later, a second diagnosis revealed the injury wasn't serious at all. The briefcase was already gone, and Vince was furious. The decision was based on what some insiders called over-dramatized complaints. That didn't just cost Kennedy his push, it cost him Vince's trust. Then came the final straw. In 2009, Kennedy returned from injury and was thrown into a match on Raw involving top talent, Randy Orton included. Reports say Kennedy hit Orton with a move that was just a little too stiff for Randy's liking. Orton allegedly voiced his frustration to management, and Cena backed him up. Less than 48 hours later, Kennedy was released. Vince didn't publicly comment. He didn't need to. Those close to the situation said it all boiled down to trust, professionalism, and mouth control. Kennedy had talent, but Vince saw him as a risk. He said too much, too often, and didn't know when to stay quiet. Years later, Kennedy opened up about his WWE exit and admitted he could have handled things differently. But by then, it was too late. Vince had already moved on. And once you're labeled as someone who talks too much backstage, getting back in the door is next to impossible. And here's the kicker. Kennedy's mic skills were what made him a star. But in Vince's world, if you use that voice in the wrong room, it'll bury you. But if Kennedy's fall was about politics, the next star on Vince's can't stand list was different entirely. There's no shortage of superstars who got over with fans but fell flat with Vince McMahon. But no case is more frustrating or more debated than Zack Ryder. Ryder wasn't supposed to be a top guy. He was a mid-carder, often used for comic relief. But in 2011, he did something almost no one else dared to try. He made himself famous. While WWE kept him off TV, Ryder started his own YouTube show, Z, True Long Island Story, and it exploded. Fans loved it. He was funny, self-aware, and most importantly, authentic. His catchphrases, outfits, and DIY promos went viral before viral was even a thing in wrestling. The fans chanted his name at live events. He trended weekly on Twitter. He was everywhere, except where it mattered most, WWE's main storylines. Why? Because Vince didn't buy it. Backstage reports say McMahon just didn't understand the appeal. He saw Ryder's gimmick as a joke, an internet sideshow, not a real draw. Even as Ryder's merch sold out and arenas echoed with "We want Ryder" chants, Vince stayed cold. He believed the momentum was a fluke, manufactured, not his vision. Eventually, WWE gave Ryder a slight push, just enough to test the waters. He won the U.S. title, got a few good storylines, and then he was written off TV in a humiliating fashion, involving Kane, Eve Torres, and being wheeled off in a neck brace. It was as if Vince had handed him the spotlight just to prove a point. You think this guy's a star? Let's see how he handles being a joke again. Even when Ryder shocked the world by winning the Intercontinental title at WrestleMania 32, it lasted one day. He dropped the belt the next night on Raw. No follow-up, no storyline. Just a brief nod, then back to catering. And yet, Ryder never stopped trying. He kept reinventing himself, kept hustling, kept chasing a dream Vince never shared. In interviews after his release in 2020, Ryder, real name Matt Cardona, never badmouthed McMahon. But he made one thing clear. He knew he was fighting an uphill battle the whole time. Ironically, since leaving WWE, Cardona has thrived. He's become one of the hottest names on the independent scene, winning titles in GCW, NWA, and Impact. He's even teased a WWE return, but only on his terms. Looking back, Zack Ryder's story is more than just a missed opportunity. It's a reminder that in Vince's WWE, fan support doesn't always equal success. Because no matter how loud the chants got, if Vince didn't believe in you, you were already done. But there's one final name on Vince's list. And this one wasn't about danger, betrayal, or personality. It was about power. In WWE, there's an unspoken rule. No one is bigger than the company. But CM Punk shattered that illusion, and Vince McMahon never fully recovered from it. When Punk dropped the infamous pipe bomb in 2011, it wasn't just a promo. It was a detonation. He called out WWE's creative, its backstage politics, and even McMahon himself, live on national TV. No script, no filter, just raw truth. Fans ate it up. Punk wasn't just a rebel, he was their rebel. He said what they were thinking. And for a brief moment, Vince leaned into it. Punk's momentum was undeniable, and McMahon smelled money. The result? One of the most iconic runs in modern wrestling, including a 434-day title reign. But behind the scenes, things were different. Punk was never afraid to speak his mind. He challenged creative decisions, questioned logic, argued over health protocols, merchandise payouts, and the way part-time legends like The Rock or Brock Lesnar were given top billing over full-timers like him. To Vince, that wasn't passion. It was insubordination. Tension boiled over in 2014. Punk walked out the night after the Royal Rumble, fed up with what he called toxic culture. He later revealed he'd been working injured, burned out, and ignored. Vince tried to smooth things over, but Punk wasn't budging. And in a now infamous twist, WWE sent Punk his official termination papers on his wedding day. Whether intentional or coincidental, that act sealed the deal. Punk went scorched earth in interviews. Vince later called it a coincidence, but the damage was done. Punk became one of the few top stars who left WWE not just bitter, but openly vocal about it for years. Even as fans chanted his name long after he was gone, Vince refused to acknowledge him. CM Punk had done the unthinkable. He challenged Vince's authority and won the public over. That, more than anything, made him dangerous. Punk eventually returned to wrestling in AEW, reigniting his career and drawing massive attention. But for Vince, that wasn't comeback. It was a threat, because Punk proved a truth Vince had spent decades denying, that sometimes one man can take on the system and win. And for a man obsessed with control, that was the one kind of superstar he couldn't stand. Now, with Vince stepping back and a new era of WWE emerging, there's one final question. Has the king of wrestling finally learned to let go of old grudges? Or will his legacy always be shadowed by the enemies he created? For decades, Vince McMahon was the puppet master of professional wrestling. Every match, every storyline, every push or burial, nothing happened without his say. But behind the spectacle was a man with firm opinions, long memories, and a ruthless sense of control. From wrestlers who challenged his authority, like CM Punk and Chyna, to those who simply didn't fit his mold, like Zack Ryder or Mr. Kennedy. Vince's grudges weren't just personal. They shaped careers. They built legends and buried others, sometimes unfairly, sometimes out of pure business calculation. But now, at 79, Vince is no longer the untouchable king. With new leadership at WWE and Vince stepping further into the background, fans are left wondering, was all the controversy worth it? Did the empire he built come at too great a cost? Because while Vince gave wrestling its golden age, he also left behind a trail of broken relationships, bitter exits, and stories that still spark outrage today. And now, as he finally begins to speak on his past and open up about the stars he clashed with, fans are listening more closely than ever. One thing certain, love him or hate him, Vince McMahon never played it safe. He built an empire by trusting his instincts. But sometimes those instincts left incredible talent out in the cold. And for every name he's finally admitting he couldn't stand, there are probably a dozen more he'll never talk about. So, who's next to be revealed? And what other stories are still being buried? That is a story for another video. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Vince McMahon's untold stories, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more insider content. Hit the bell so you never miss an update. See you in the next one.